Hi, it's me. Thank you for viewing my blog again. Well, it's January 29th. It is the Florida primary. And I thought I would talk to you a little bit about the Florida primary. It's kind of interesting. The Democratic National Committee has a Committee on Rules and Bylaws. And several years ago, they passed some amendments to the standing rules of the Democratic Party. One of those bylaws changes I was a little bit involved with. It involved creating a category of delegates and representation for underrepresented groups. And it was kind of an interesting battle because there was already rules in place, affirmative action rules, for African Americans, people of color, and women. And the reason those rules were put in place is because those were groups that were historically denied representation within the Democratic Party. The new categories that were being proposed were for lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgendered people, and people with disabilities. Now, there was a lot of discussion within the party. I won't say arguing, there was a lot of discussion within the party because there hasn't been a means of historically excluding those groups. It is true that those groups have been underrepresented, but they weren't being historically excluded. There were no rules in place saying you can't have. It just turned out that there's an undercurrent in our society to discriminate against those groups. So there was a compromise proposed where the affirmative action rules stayed unchanged, but there were new inclusion rules proposed. And these inclusion rules said that states needed to set specific limits, specific goals for representing lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgendered people, and people with disabilities. What this means in practice is that there will be people at the convention that will look more like America. And that's a good thing. When I was on the platform committee in 2004, I had the honor, as well as being somewhat uncomfortable position, of having to make an amendment to the platform for transgendered people. It was an honor because anytime that you get to stand up and speak for inclusion of people that aren't there, it is a privilege to do. At least I think it's a privilege to do. It's a little uncomfortable because the transgendered people wanted to be there themselves, and there were no transgender people on the platform committee. So it was left to me, a gay man, to act as a surrogate for them, to speak for them. And while that, again, is an honor, it also puts me in this position of not speaking from a first-hand experience. And it's hard. Anyway, the result of that was that the amendment was withdrawn at the request of the transgender delegation, whom I was in contact with, and they got some meetings with the carrier representatives at the convention. There was another fallout. There was another thing that happened almost immediately afterwards, which is that the Human Rights Campaign decided that they would fight for transgender inclusion in the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. That's an entirely different kettle of fish. So back to Florida. We have this thing called the Platform Committee, which is really kind of the most interesting committee because you're dealing with all the policy issues, you're dealing with how the Democrats are going to respond to the war in Iraq, and what we're going to do with Medicaid, and how we're going to deal with welfare, and is there going to be a raise in the minimum wage to work for a living wage? All these really interesting kind of wonky questions that I really get into. And then there are the boring committees, like the Credentials Committee. The Credentials Committee meets, I believe it's the day before the convention convenes, and they decide who gets seated at the convention. So they go through and they say Pennsylvania gets 80 delegates, and Florida gets 78 delegates, and Texas gets 90 delegates, and all these really boring things that are already established. Well, this year it's not quite so boring, because one of the rules that the DNC propagated several years ago was that there would be an ordering to the primaries. That New Hampshire would be the first primary, Iowa would be the first caucus, South Carolina and Nevada would move up in the ranking, and then the other states shouldn't hold primaries prior to those. And the date they said, I believe, was February 5th. There shouldn't be primaries prior to February 5th, which is where you get Super Tuesday next week, which is going to be really exciting, and I'm kind of looking forward to that. But some state legislatures decided that they were going to play games, and those two states were Michigan and Florida. Michigan's primary has already occurred, and you may not have heard about it because they say, you know, Hillary has 2 primaries and Obama has 2 primaries. Hillary has 3. Hillary won Michigan. Now, it may not exactly be a win because she was the only person on the ballot there on the Democratic side, but when Michigan gets seated, she gets their delegates, if they get seated. Florida similarly has more candidates on the ballot, but I think that tomorrow we will see that Hillary Clinton is going to win Florida. In which case it's 4-2, although the media is probably going to still say it's 2-2, because, you know, we can't actually have this, you know, real thing that's going on because of these little rules that the DNC put down. Well, that leaves a fight in the Credentials Committee. And the people that will be sitting on that Credentials Committee are also established by the delegates. There will be a fight to seat the committee members from Florida and Michigan, and there will be a fight to seat the delegates. So the question becomes, you know, do we seat a delegation that intentionally violated the rules? It can get even more interesting if you don't have a candidate that has the specific number of delegates to win the nomination. You know, what if Hillary is 50 delegates behind, and if you seat Michigan and Florida, she has enough? Do you seat Michigan and Florida, or do you not? Do you have the Obama people saying, no, we don't want them seated because he doesn't have many delegates there? Or versus the Hillary people saying, yeah, we want her seated because, you know, she's our candidate, and we want to do what she says. I'm sure the parties or the campaigns are going to be whipping their delegations like crazy. And I understand the whipping part from being on the platform committee, where they run around saying, we want you to vote this way, and we're going to oppose your amendment if you bring it up. So I think it's going to be interesting. Anyway, that's kind of the backstory and the politically wonky story behind what's going on in Florida today. And so thanks for watching, and we'll talk more tomorrow. Bye.